thought I would speak on happiness. And you'll find out whenever I pick a topic, I usually pick it because there's something confusing about it. We saw with this covering everything with God and being the witness, the little confusion with these things. And we can say also with the happiness that there's something elusive about this concept and this idea, and even the possibility of happiness when we enter into spiritual life and spiritual practice. Sometimes we wonder, is it a good idea to even think in terms of happiness? Should we strive for happiness? Sometimes we're warned against it. Then we'll see even some of these very austere Vedantic texts, Ashtavakra Samhita and other things. They'll say this Sukhi Bhava, so then be happy. They'll warn us about it, and at the same time they'll say be happy. So we'll see that this Vedantic tradition is a little bit confused, a little conflicted about this idea of happiness. And we'll see, because really, when we say happiness, it's a wide range of different types of happiness and things that make us happy. So, on the one hand, we hear that everyone is seeking happiness, that this is the one great motivating power for everyone. Even Swamiji himself will say that sometimes, that we're all seeking happiness in our own way, that even the thief, when the thief robs, why does he do it? He wants to make him happy somehow. So the yogi who's meditating in the forest, he's also seeking happiness. So a tremendous motivating power, this idea of happiness. On the other hand, we're told that it's an illusion, that at best, this happiness will come wearing a crown of thorns on its head. Swamiji gives that example. And the more we seek it, the more we get entangled in the world, the more we get frustrated, and the more we invite suffering on ourselves. So we have these two different aspects, and happiness in the world. We read that this world is anityam asukham lokam, that it's transitory. Okay, everyone knows that it's transitory, but asukham, there's no happiness here. So, is it true? We will find a whole section in the Gita about different types of happiness. So we know that it's not true from a very literal point of view, but lasting happiness, if we look at it from that point of view, the highest type of happiness, the world is not the place where we will seek it. So we will read things like that, and then right after that, we'll hear ourselves saying, Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, may everyone be happy. So we have this kind of conflict, internal conflict. We're warned against running after happiness. As I said, there's sukheshana. This is one of the things where, especially if we want to take to a life of renunciation, we renounce any desire to be happy, or at least any desire for personal happiness or some type of limited type of happiness. And many people will do it. They'll lead a life where they'll renounce all idea of personal happiness. And why do they do it? To be happy. So we find that it's still at the very base of it that this is a great motivating power, whether we realize it or not, and whether we like it or not. There are even people who like to be miserable. There are people who like to suffer. And we say, why do you like to suffer? Why do you like to be... They may not say it, but the bottom line is it makes them happy. All right, there are people who are happy when they're not happy. There's an old song that says, very glad to be unhappy. Yeah, about unrequited love. It's old standard song. Someone that they're happy when their love is not returned. So because there's so much in love, so I'm very glad to be unhappy. So even unhappiness can bring us happiness. That's the motivating power for everything. There's a conversation that takes place in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna towards the end of Thakur's life in Kashipur between two of the great characters of the Gospel, Dr. Sharkar and Girish Ghosh. If ever they do some type of drama, these two have to be prominently portrayed there because they're very interesting characters in both of them. And so they're having this big argument about this happiness being the motivating power behind everything that that people do. Ultimately, we do everything to be happy. So Girish Ghosh, he was the great playwright and the great bohemian who did everything to try to make himself happy when he was young in the wrong way, then found Thakur and found a better way. And he said that happiness is the basic motive power behind everything that we do. Then Dr. Sharkar says no, that he's a doctor. So he says very often I'll sacrifice my own happiness, my own personal happiness to serve someone else, to help someone else. And then Girish Ghosh argues back. He says, but you do it because it makes you feel good, it makes you happy. So then Dr. Sharkar simply remains silent that way. So we see both sides of this. The great emphasis in every tradition, Vedantic tradition, that we should be happy. There's nothing wrong with it. And we see also that all of the traps and all of the problems that come along if our only goal in life is to be happy. So we have to find some type of balance with this whole idea of happiness. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that we use this term in many different ways. Even the English term happiness we use in different ways, but sukha, the main term for happy, we'll often find it combined with dukkha, suffering. Sukha, dukkha, they'll be hand in hand that way. So that we can't think of happiness without thinking of suffering, that they'll go together. If we want to accept one, we have to accept the other. At the same time, the same sukha, we'll say satchit sukha swarupaya swami tabhani. We'll use it as identical with ananda, with the highest bliss. The same term can be used for worldly happiness, it can be used for spiritual happiness. Sri Ramakrishna talks about 3 different types of joy. Here he uses the term ananda. We have the Vishayananda, Bhajanananda, and Brahmananda. Vishayananda is the joy or happiness that comes through sense objects. So just worldly pleasure. And he doesn't say here that, oh, it's horrible, you shouldn't get engaged in it. He just says there's something higher than that. Higher than that, Bhajanananda. The joy that we get through worship, through spiritual practice, through visiting temples, keeping holy company, all of those things, they give us a certain type of joy, higher type of joy. But nothing compared to Brahmananda, the joy that comes through realization. When we have that final, ultimate experience of God, this will be the highest type of ananda, the highest type of joy. Now, each one of these actually has its own role to play in life. If we're not ready for the higher ones and we get rid of the lower ones, we have nothing left. So we have to see that each has its role to play, each has its own positives, and in some cases its own negatives. And we have to understand the difference and the distinction between these different types of sukha or happiness, so that we don't simply abandon the whole idea of happiness and say, no, I don't care about happiness. Let me be miserable, not because it'll bring us happiness, but because somehow we think if we're spiritual people, we shouldn't seek happiness on some level. There's something, and we've had that in many different religious traditions, or we call them puritanical, where the slightest bit of personal happiness or joy is considered sinful somehow. So this Vedanta isn't a puritanical type of tradition like that, where we'll make a blanket statement that all types of happiness are somehow contrary to spiritual life and spiritual practice. When we analyze different types of happiness and what's recommended for us and what we're warned against, we find that it depends very much on what situation we're in, what stage of life. We have this concept of varnashrama dharma, that each one of us has a different stage of life that we belong to, and in the traditional Indian context, everyone belonged to their own caste. That meant that they had their own occupation, their own particular duties, their own special role to play within society. So, for example, in the student stage of life, this is the first stage. We have student stage, then at a certain age, married life, and then children come, and then children are grown up and out of the house, and we're free to retire, then we lead a retired life and go into the forest. That lasts for a certain period of time, and then at the end, devote ourselves entirely to spiritual life and take to a life of complete and full renunciation. So these are the different stages in life, and during the householder stage especially, there'll be special duties that people have according to the occupation that they have. So, in the student stage of life, we're supposed to form the foundation for the rest of our life in terms of many things, in terms of spirituality, in terms of ethical, moral life, and dharma, in terms of our occupation. This is when we learn a trade or a profession or an occupation, something like that. And we'll find that there are 4 aims of life also that will correspond to the different stages of life. So in this first stage, most important aspect is dharma. We have to learn righteousness because we'll be given a little free rein in the next stage of life. We're allowed to have a little fun in the next stage of life, and unless it's guided by dharma, guided by some sense of right and wrong, some sense of selflessness, what's good for society, not just us, then we'll get into a lot of trouble. So, we're supposed to learn about dharma, this stage of life, duties and obligations, as well as these higher principles of life, such as this whole idea that we're supposed to sacrifice. This idea of sacrifice is very important, which also brings happiness, by the way. This idea of offering back to society because we get so much from society. So we have these different rinas, they call them, obligations or debts or yajnas, sacrifice that we do, where we keep the wheels of society running smoothly by looking after everyone and caring not just for ourselves, but caring for the whole social framework. So, this student stage of life, also, we get grounded in spiritual practice, meditation, study. We learn about ritual things that have to be done in the householder stage of life. Now, we don't find happiness specifically mentioned as one of the things that we seek in this stage of life. But we find that those who lead this type of life, the student life, they're the ones who are happy. We look at students today, and either there's this tremendous peer pressure from their friends with regard to social things and boyfriends and girlfriends, and that they're miserable, so much pressure, or there's pressure for them to do well in their studies. The parents are constantly pushing them to do better and better and better, and it's very difficult, especially during teenage years, for there to be any semblance of real happiness at that time. But if there's balance, if the parents don't press too much, and if they don't care about all these social things too much, this stage of life also can be a very rewarding stage of life. Now, we should understand that none of this means, in any of these stages of life, that we can have some simple pleasures of life, that we can't strive to be successful. I'm not saying that, let your kids be bad students, but don't put that type of pressure on them that how many students commit suicide nowadays, right? Because if they didn't do well on the exam, they won't get into a college they're supposed to. Yeah, so it can go to an extreme like that. Then we get to the householder stage of life, and here we have the trial, and here we have the temptations, because here we're allowed to strive for some type of happiness. And we have 2 of the goals of life, artha and kama. That means we're allowed to earn money and accumulate wealth, have property, all of these things, and we're allowed to fulfill legitimate desires. This is where dharma comes in. Any desire that's not contrary to these teachings of dharma. Any desire that we have that will cause harm to others, or that will ultimately cause harm to ourselves, these we're not supposed to pursue. But these what they call legitimate desires, these are permitted during this householder stage of life. And we'll see that sometimes there's a conflict because we have to practice self-sacrifice in this stage of life also, because the dharma that we learned in the student stage of life with regard to our occupation and how we act, this we have to put into practice here. So we had the dharma as the goal of first stage of life. Here we have artha and kama, and we have to accumulate wealth, artha, in order to fulfill the third one, kama. If we want to fulfill our desires, we have to have some means to do it. Now, these are the two things that are most often mentioned, especially by Sri Ramakrishna, as the main obstacles in spiritual life. What is artha and kama if not kamani kanchan? He says specifically, watch out for lust and gold. And these are the two things that are meant. Of course, he's talking mostly to his young disciples who will lead a monastic life, but in general, to be cautious about these two things. So even though we're given the opportunity to seek happiness through these, we have to know that it's a double-edged sword. If we seek happiness in a certain way, then we may have to suffer for it also in a slightly different way. So these are considered legitimate goals of life because we actually can get some type of happiness if we practice discrimination and moderation. And as I said before, there's nothing in this Vedantic tradition that says we shouldn't have some measure of happiness, even what we call worldly happiness, that we can get happy. We can get tremendous happiness from having a successful job, from raising a family, to seeing children grow up and grandchildren. We can get tremendous amount of deep satisfaction and joy and happiness from all of this if we're sensible about this. So there's nothing wrong with any of these things. We should try to seek these things, and even a little bit of happiness, a little bit of joy that makes us forget the problems of life. I always go back to this great statement that Swamiji's father said to him. You may remember when Swamiji was a boy, Narendra. His father was extremely generous and used to give away a lot of his money, especially to relatives who would waste the money and wouldn't work themselves. They were hopeless people, many of them. And some of them had a lot of problems and emotional problems, and some drank and did all sorts of things. So Narendra said to his father, why do you give them money when sometimes they'll just go out and they'll drink with that money or something? So his father said, you're a young boy now. When you grow older, you'll understand that this life is not such an easy thing, that for many people there's a great deal of suffering in life. If their suffering can be removed, even momentarily, even that is doing some small service for them. When you get older, you'll understand. So his father was wonderful like that. His father, one of Swamiji's other brothers, said that giving money away to the needy and poor, and it was a kind of sickness with his father. He was so generous that way, and of course, it led to tremendous problems in the family. When his father passed away, they were in debt, even though he was a wealthy man, and it caused so many difficulties for Swamiji himself. So we see that this little bit of happiness is okay, but there's always some tension between dharma and sukha, between the performance of duty and happiness, because happiness ultimately has a little bit of a self-centered aspect to it, and dharma is always forgetting ourselves and doing something for the sake of duty and obligation. We find in Gita this ultimate example of someone having to perform dharma in a situation that he feels personally cannot possibly lead to sukha, to happiness. He's asked to fight in battle against his own relatives, his own cousins and uncles, and those who were his own teachers, and he thinks that it's impossible. How is it possible to get happiness from that? Now, so what does Sri Krishna say? He says, Sukhinas kshatriya partha labhante yudham idrasham. Any kshatriya, he's a warrior, any kshatriya who can find a battle such as this will be sukhi, he'll be happy. Now, why happy? Two reasons. One is that he's a warrior, and this is dharma, this is righteousness. And he's fulfilling his duty. He's doing something that, at personal sacrifice, will be for the welfare of society for generations to come. Secondly, Sri Krishna tells him that even if you die in such a battle for the sake of righteousness, you die for the sake of righteousness, there'll be an open gate to heaven for you. So you don't have to worry about any of that. You're absolved of any sin that would come from even killing your kinsman, because this dharma trumps everything. This was the belief that was prevalent at that time. So he's trying to convince him to fight. One of the arguments is that any kshatriya who has this opportunity will be happy. But right after that, he starts to tell him, forget about happiness. He says, the first thing you have to do is throw that out the window. He says, sukha dukkhe same kritva. Look upon them as the same. Whether you're happy, whether you're unhappy. Don't let it make any difference to you. Labha, alabha. Whether you gain something, whether you lose something. Then, even whether you win or whether you lose, make it the same. That means that don't allow your happiness to be determined by the outcome or your unhappiness. That have the same state of mind, you've performed your duty, that's the end of it. If you're successful, okay. If you're not successful, okay. So then he says, therefore, fight. And fight in this battle, and don't worry, you won't incur any type of sin. And then later he says also fight, but free from this feverish feeling that we get when we have to engage in something. Jwara, vigada, jwara. Free from this rajas that comes, and with a little calmness. Try to do everything with a little bit of calmness there. So we see that happiness is allowed, it's trumped by duty, but it's also seen as one of the pairs of opposites. If we accept happiness, we have to accept unhappiness. If we're willing to invest in something that will give us a little joy, we should expect a little letdown afterwards. If something is there which pleases us, then we lose it and we'll be displeased. This is just the nature of the world. So we have to be prepared. If we want to seek certain types of joy and pleasure and happiness in life, we have to be prepared for those periods when it's removed from us, when we don't have it. Now, there's a second reason why we're allowed to seek pleasure and joy in the world through property, through wealth, through fulfillment of desires, through family, and in this stage of life, and that is so we can see through them. We can see that they bring a certain type of joy, but not anything lasting, that there's something hollow about it. We're given this opportunity. It's kind of presented to us as a very nice thing. Now you get a chance to enjoy yourself, but ultimately it's meant to show us that, yeah, it's okay, but it's ultimately not fulfilling. There has to be something more. If this is all there is, then that's not what it's advertised to be. So this is part of the reason why we're told to try to get some joy out of the world. And Sri Ramakrishna gives so many nice examples. There's a certain type of fruit called a hog plum. And it's got a great big stone in the middle. And the outside, like most plums, the outside is very bitter. There's just a little bit of flesh in there. And that little bit of flesh is a little tasty. So the people like this fruit, a little bit tasty, but it gives you colic. People get sick from it. But because that little bit of flavor is inside, they'll undergo all of that just for that. And then he talks about the camel. There's a certain type of tree that has very tasty leaves on it. And the camel is very fond of it. But it has thorns. So every time the camel will eat the leaves, the gums will bleed. And it will be very painful for the camel. But it likes the taste of the leaves, so it does it over and over again. It never learns that lesson. We're supposed to learn that lesson, that if the thorns are there, then maybe better to just forego the nice, tasty leaves that are there. So this is what we do in this stage of life. So we're not told to reject happiness or enjoyment or to have some type of hatred for it, but we're supposed to pursue it, and we're supposed to do it cautiously and with our eyes wide open so that we see what exactly is there and how fulfilling it is. And can that really be a goal for us, that this is what life is about, to try to get as much enjoyment and pleasure. So we learn to be a little bit indifferent to it, especially if it conflicts with duty. Then we should easily put it aside. This is one thing that Swamiji talks about, something that's natural to the mother. If the mother has a small child and the tiger comes, he says, where will the mother be? She'll be in the mouth of the tiger. She'll forget her own happiness, her own safety, everything for the sake of the child. So this selflessness, when that comes, we see that there are much higher values in life than just seeking this type of a happiness. We have as the highest model and the highest goal this Stita Prajna. Stita Prajna is someone who has this perfect steadiness, this wisdom and calmness and everything. And one of the definitions that we have is that such a person is not at all agitated or upset in the midst of suffering or things that don't go right, or any physical pain or illness or anything like that. And they're free from any longing for happiness. So the sukha dukkha. They're free from any longing for happiness. But this is the final stage. So in this third stage of life, second stage of life, householder stage of life, we get this opportunity to experiment a little bit and to discriminate between different types of happiness. Now we'll see that there are different types of happiness based also on the three gunas. This is a very nice section that we have in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 18. It talks about this type of happiness that we can associate with tamas, the lowest of the three gunas, and then happiness we associate with rajas, and then finally with sattva. They started with sattva first and go down. I want to start the other way around, but we'll see that there's a happiness, even these three different types of happiness are based a little bit on the different stages of life and also on the nature of the individual, the swabhava. The nature of the individual will naturally seek different types, because if it's tamasic happiness and we're tamasic people, we'll go for that. And we'll also find that that we're complex people, that there are certain types of happiness that we enjoy that are extremely tamasic, and certain things that are perfectly sattvic, and we also appreciate that. We can never brand anyone, say, oh, that person is so rajasic, so tamasic, or such a sattvic person, because we have all different aspects to our personality. And it's good for us to analyze. We can try to figure out what our own nature is by seeing what makes us happy, or what we try to make us happy with, the things we go after to make us happy. So we can look at this in these descriptions in two different ways. One is we can see where we fit, the type of happiness that we like. And they say, oh, then really I thought I was so sattvic, I'm a little tamasic. And the second thing is that if we want to become sattvic people, then we can pursue this sattvic type of happiness. So this also gives us some incentive to try to change the type of things that we long for or that we seek. Now, this tamas, it says that type of happiness or enjoyment or pleasure, which both in the beginning and in the end. So we start out with, we'll see this happiness is determined to a great extent not just by the period of enjoyment, but what the consequence is. So here's both in the beginning and as a consequence has the power to delude the self delude regarding our real nature, this happiness arises from sleep, laziness, and carelessness. That type of pleasure, or that type of happiness, is declared to be tamasic. Now, this tamasic happiness is a little bit dangerous because we find no reason to give it up. We get sunk in it. And of course, it has a very dark side to it also. There's some people who get happiness out of even torturing other people, but in general, for most of us, it'll be more just this procrastination or this couch potato syndrome. Yeah, where we're happy doing nothing. Now, it's not such a bad thing. That we shouldn't, as I say, sometimes a little dose of tamasic happiness, we'll get some joy out of it. I can tell you honestly, if I had not led the type of life that I'm leading now, if I had gone into a different profession, on a Sunday today, I would be very happy to sit on the couch all day long, watching football games and eating junk food. Yeah, I'd be perfectly happy. But a whole lifetime, I could never do it. A little dose of it, it's okay. It's not too bad. So, as I say, everything is balanced, and everything we have to see the extent to which it grabs hold of us. The problem with tamas is that we can spiral down into it, and we see people that they never get off the couch. They never go for the job. They never do anything, and they turn to drinking and drugs and all sorts of things. So this tamas can be really debilitating. Sri Ramakrishna says that tamas kills. The rajas binds us. Sattva will take us out of the forest, but the tamas, that's the robber who wants to kill us. So we have to be cautious about too much of this tamas. Then, rajas, we get a little bit higher here. And it says that type of happiness, which arises from contact between sense organs and sense objects. See, with the tamas, we don't even go to the trouble to enjoy things outside. We're happy just being in a dark room all alone, doing nothing. This is when we go out and we want to enjoy everything, have the best food, drink, everything. So it arises from the contact between sense organs and sense objects, which in the beginning is like nectar. So it seems fine, but then it grates, we get saturated with it, becomes too much. So in the end, it's like poison. This is declared to be rajasic. So here we see that the consequence itself is painful. In the beginning, we think, wow, how wonderful this is, how nice this is, but we end up with the hangover the next morning. We end up with the indigestion that night, right? We think, oh, how great that I can eat this all this spicy, wonderful food and everything, and then we suffer from it afterwards. So this rajasic happiness we can understand by the consequence, and long-term consequence, not just the next day, but we find that the mind constantly wants to run after these things, and we end up with this bondage, and we end up with all sorts of other types of problems. Now, the happiness that comes from tamas and rajas is basically worldly. We talk about three different gunas, but really this tamas and rajas, these two really go together. And sattva stands a little bit apart because sattva is the one that pulls us higher. The other two either they keep us stuck or take us down lower. So the sattvic happiness, it'll be a higher type of happiness. It may be some intellectual type of happiness. We read fine books, we see fine art, things like that. Or we can look upon it as really spiritual, that the joy that will come. This will be more of that Atmajnanananda and Brahmananda. So it involves a certain type of transformation, a certain type of change. And we'll see that with the same concept of what it's like in the beginning and what it's like at the end. Because the rajasic happiness, it tasted like nectar in the beginning, and then it turned into poison at the end. This we'll find is the opposite. In the beginning, we don't have much of a taste for it. Sometimes with very fine things, food or art or music or something. First time we hear it, we think, no, I don't quite get it. They'll say, no, listen to it a few more times. And we'll listen, we'll say, and now I see there's so much expertise goes into this, and the harmonies are so complex, and then we really see the subtlety of it, we see the beauty of it. So this sattvic joy is the type that in the beginning seems to be like poison, and at the end becomes like nectar. Now, all of these different types of happiness, they all involve the transformation, and they all involve something spiritual. This is something that Swamiji talks about. Really, all joy that comes from us is from within. The main distinction is that with this tamasic and rajasic happiness, we don't realize that, and we search for it outside of ourselves. The sattvic happiness comes from this realization that there's a real joy, this well of joy is within ourselves. And that, by turning within, this is where we experience that higher type of happiness. So, what are the things that lead to this sattvic happiness? Renunciation, surrender, self-control, and all of these things really are meant for that final stage of life. Or we can say the last two stages of life, or even if we're in the householder stage of life, the householders who feel that now their main goal is a spiritual goal. So that, or even student life, they can do that. But those who don't have to go through this whole game of enjoyment and suffering, that they realize there's something higher. So we find that the very things that we're told to enjoy in the householder state of life, that we're asked to renounce here, if we want this higher type of joy. So the same kama and artha, the same things, this worldly desires and accumulation of wealth, we realize that no, this won't give us happiness. So the sattvic type of happiness, either we can be very extreme about it and say, no, I give it up. Or if we don't want to go to that extreme, then we practice simplicity. We practice moderation. We don't go for the job that will give a little more money but will take us away from the family in order to get a bigger house that'll be a bigger mortgage that'll make us work longer. We practice a little sanity with regard to our personal life also. We find in the Vedantic tradition all the different stories and teachings and verses, scriptural passages and everything, which will try to impress upon us the ephemeral nature of worldly happiness and the distinction between that and the happiness that comes through not just realization, but the happiness that comes through renunciation. And this is the funny thing, because we sometimes think that renunciation itself is the poison. It doesn't taste very nice. What joy can there be in just giving something up? Right? You see, it sounds so negative and everything. But those who practice this renunciation, those who really can do it, it's not a negative thing, it's a very positive thing. There's tremendous joy and freedom that comes because we get bound by our possessions a little bit. So anyhow, we'll find that there are some beautiful verses and stories that Sri Ramakrishna tells about these things. There's one poem, hymn, that is attributed to Shankaracharya called the Bhaja Govindam. Now, you hear the title Bhaja Govindam, and you may think, oh, it's a very devotional thing, worship the Lord, worship Sri Krishna himself, but full of renunciation. The hymn itself, if you're not ready, it'll frighten you, you'll run away when you hear some of the verses in this hymn. And It's based on, there's always a story behind these different poems, the hymns that Shankaracharya wrote. The story is that he was going for bath in the Ganges one day in Benares, and he saw an old man who was sitting by the bank of the river and trying to memorize these different rules of grammar, this is Panini grammar. So picture some old man in this country sitting and saying, I before ye except after C, I before ye except after C. So just over and over again, repeating this one sutra from Panini. And the Shankaracharya, he thought to himself, this man, he could die any minute. He's that age. What is he doing? He's just trying to memorize some grammatical rule. Will that save him at the time of death? Now is the time to do some spiritual practice. So there's a whole hymn is trying to impress upon him or us this idea that when we go, we'll give up everything. And this renunciation is our preparation, and there's a certain type of joy in renunciation, a certain type of happiness that we get. Counterintuitive. It sounds like poison in the beginning, but it'll be the real nectar. So there are two nice verses, one that shows the positive side and one that shows the negative side. We find one line that says, artam anartam. Artam, we saw that arta is all of our possessions. Now, there's a play on words here. Anarta, arta also means a significance or meaning. So our possessions are anarta. They're meaningless. They're meaningless. They're worthless. What will they do? We won't take them with us. We think we own them. We don't really own them. Sometimes we'll read that they own us. We think we own them, that they own us. So, artam anartam bhavayanityam. Constantly tell yourself this. Meditate on this idea. Day after day, try to impress this idea on your mind that you're running after something that can't possibly give you pleasure, some external thing. A little taste of joy we will get from these things, but compared to the higher type of joy, which it may prevent us from getting, then it's really ultimately anartha. Then it says, tata sukhalesham, nasti tata sukhalesham satyam. Really, really and truly, he says, let me tell you, there's not even the slightest trace of happiness in them. Now, it sounds too strong. We know we get a little bit of happiness out of these things, but he's talking about ultimately. Ultimately, in the final end of this, we realize that the joy wasn't from anything external, it was from within, and we can turn directly within and get that type of joy. Then we get this positive side. So the whole section's about foolish people who waste their lives in external things, never searching for the real self, and then the sadhus, or spiritual people who understand what the real goal of life is. So he says that living under a tree, wandering from place to place, sleeping on the ground, and having no possessions. No possessions. Then it says, sarva parigraha bhoga tyagaha. So renouncing the happiness, the enjoyment, the pleasure that comes from any possession, whatever possessions we have that can possibly give us some pleasure, we give them up. Then he says, kasya sukham nakaroti viragaha. It's supposed to be a rhetorical question. Rhetorical question, who will not get joy out of this type of renunciation? But really it's not a rhetorical question, it's a good question. And it's a hard question because if we ask ourselves that, then most of us will say, no, I won't get any joy out of that. You tell me to give up everything, what kind of joy is that? Because we're not ready for it. We have to really, the mind has to be very much prepared for that. And there's a very high state of spirituality. We're all monks here, and yet we haven't given up all of these things. We have a nice place where we live, and we get nice food and everything. He's talking about those who really, they sleep under a tree and have no possessions whatsoever. And there's a freedom that comes from that, a certain type of joy that comes from that. So we ask ourselves, would we get any type of joy or pleasure or happiness from such a life? And the answer is, if we're prepared for it, yes, tremendous joy. Even a little taste of the joy of renunciation. It's a funny thing, but sometimes we'll have something and it's such a, we have a car, and we have to get insurance, we have to get it registered, we have to change the oil, we do all of these things, and then one day we get rid of it, and we find that, oh, I take the bus, take this, and it's just the mind is clear, it's free from that, and we think, all of these years I thought that I couldn't live without it. Now I find that it's easier. I can live quite nicely without it. So this also can come, this idea of being happiness coming from giving something up. What do we find in Gita? Some wonderful verses that talk about who is the happy person. One says, the person who can withstand the impulse born of desire and anger, even before the fall of the body. So someone who has self-control. Such a person is a real yogi. Such a person is happy. Sasukhi nara, that's a happy person. The person who is free from all of this, who is free from the lower nature dragging us around from place to place. When we have self-control, that also brings us this type of freedom. Now, the nice example we have of how renunciation can bring happiness, we find in this Avadhuta Gita. Thakur refers to the story of the kite. Kite is some big eagle-like bird. Some big bird that catches a big fish and is flying and is very happy that it has a huge fish that he'll be able to go and get several nice meals out of it. Such a nice thing that he was able to catch this big fish. But all of the crows come, and the crows start picking at it because they want to get that fish. And the kite flies in one direction. It can't get rid of the crows. They make his life completely miserable until he tries to fight back somehow, and the fish falls from his mouth. And as soon as the fish falls from his mouth, all the crows leave. Now, what are these crows? They're all the anxieties and worries and problems and things that go along with possessions. And then this kite was perfectly content and perfectly happy. So this yogi is watching this avadut, and he says, and now I see what joy that comes from letting go, joy that comes from renunciation. I salute you as one of my gurus. He had all these different gurus. A very nice text, this Avadhuta Gita. So, this renunciation of self-effort, this surrender, when we become like the kitten who's happy wherever the mother places it, if we can have self-surrender, that's the ultimate type of happiness. That means we believe wherever the Divine Mother places us, it's for our best. If it's for our best, I'll be happy. I won't question it. So this sharanagati, this self-surrender brings tremendous type of happiness. The bird on the mast of the ship, after trying to find land, going where he said, no, I'll simply stay wherever the ship takes me, I'll be happy to go. So this self-surrender, this also brings a tremendous type of happiness for us. Now, this, it's just some other nice things. We find also this very wonderful phrase in Gita, this tyagat shantiranantaram, that immediately, as soon as we let go. See, when the fish fell from the mouth of the kite, it didn't take any time. Immediately we let go, and what do we get? Peace, shanti. And then the Gita says, if someone is not peaceful, ashantasya, kudasukam, where can there be any happiness if there's no peace of mind? And this peace of mind comes by letting go and practicing this type of surrender. Now, this verse about sattvic happiness, this verse has a second line to it. And there's a very nice phrase, this is Atma Buddhi Prasadajam. That means that this type of happiness, real sattvic happiness, it's prasadajam. It has its birth. It has its birth in prasada. This prasada, we know it is nice food to eat afterwards, but it means grace and it means clarity. It has a lot of meanings, this prasada. So we have to try to picture when the mind becomes perfectly clean and pure and translucent, then this is the state of grace. And Thakur talks about the grace of the mind. This is that state of grace of the mind. And this is Atma Buddhi, the grace of the mind where I know I am the self. That grace of the mind that leads us to the self-knowledge. This is really the highest type of happiness that we can possibly get. So we get these beautiful verses, some in chapter 6 on meditation, about the fruits of spiritual practice and the fruits of realization. We get this sukham atyantikam, this happiness that goes beyond all bounds. We can't restrict it. It's unlimited type of a happiness, which buddhi grahyam atindriyam, which is within the realm of this pure consciousness that we have, but is beyond any type of sense pleasure. And then it says, when this yogi, when he knows that infinite joy which transcends the senses, and he attains this sukham uttamam. It's a different category of happiness, this highest type of happiness, this highest type of bliss. It comes to the yogi whose mind is full of peace, who is free from passion, and who is sinless. Then last, there's a verse in that same section. The yogi who has become free from sin, who is ever steadfast in the self, easily becomes merged in Brahman and attains this infinite bliss, this infinite happiness. So this is that happiness which makes everything else just pale before it. That those who attain this for every other type of happiness, it's insipid. It just doesn't, not that it's a horrible, terrible thing, but in comparison to that joy, it's as if nothing. So we see that there's a big tent in which all of these types of happiness are there, and we're all free to pursue happiness in our own way. If we want to find it in the world, if we want to find happiness in the world, let us be a little sensible about it, that's all. And not make it the beginning and end of life. Let's be guided by this principle of dharma, by this principle of selflessness, by this principle of moderation. And let us be sensible enough to know that we'll have our share of suffering also. That they go hand in hand, this type of happiness. But we should also understand there's a higher type of happiness. This is Satchidananda. This is the happiness that comes through the realization of that well of joy that's already within our hearts, the divine presence within, which is the source of any type of happiness. And that a lot of these things which don't appeal to us now, which may give us a little bitter taste, the taste of poison in the beginning, that this renunciation, this surrender, this even different types of spiritual practice, that if we stick with it, if we really have some devotion to it, it'll turn into nectar for us, whether we have God realization or not. Just the very fact that we're putting these things into practice, practicing self-surrender, practicing renunciation is, according to our ability, all of this will bring us a tremendous amount of happiness right here and now. So, as always, it's a great joy to be here with all of you. And thank you so much for your patience. Yesterday was a long day. Then you have to sit to another lecture now. And so it was very nice. And with happiness. With happiness. So I hope to come back and see all of you soon. And please remember that we have a guest house. If any of you would like to come and spend some time in our center, simply email or call. And we have our website. You can get all the information, everything. We'll be very happy to have you come and stay with us for some time. So, thank you.
Many thanks, dear Atmajnanananda ji, for this wonderful exposition of a complex topic with which we actually, right from the early days of our childhood till almost we pass away from this earthly life, this is a concept that is always with us, happiness. And as he said, it's a big taint, various types of happiness are there. But then try to be sensible. That is what I liked that he was telling. He said only try to be a little sensible, but I would suggest why not to be more sensible. It is. The idea is if you are a little sensible, you will escape a little misery. If you are more sensible, you will escape more misery. If you are really truly sensible, you will get only bliss, only happiness, no misery at all. So it is the level of sensibility. But we do not become sensible quickly enough. Through the experience, as they say, is the greatest teacher, through various layers of experience we acquire more and more sensibility, and therefore the higher and higher layers of happiness in life. Thank you again, Swamiji, for this beautiful discussion.